Good morning, America. Good morning, world. Good morning, everyone who's streaming and joining Bloomberg Opinion today for our politics live stream. I'm Tim O'Brien. I oversee Bloomberg Opinion, and I'm joined today by three of my friends and brilliant columnists, editors. They sort of do everything. You've got a crowd here today that does everything. James Gibney, who is an editor and a writer for Bloomberg Opinion on politics and policy. Nia Malika Henderson, who is a columnist on politics and policy. And Nir Kaysar, who covers the markets, investing, and does amazing things with numbers for us as well. And we're going to dive into a report card about Donald Trump's early days. We're only a couple of months into his term, even less than that. But our whole collection of columns here at Bloomberg Opinion and our editors put together a package of Trump metrics. This has been an annual endeavor that we've done for every administration over the last several years, using metrics as a report card and a benchmark around presidential performance across things that matter to Americans, matter to markets, matter to policymakers, and matter, I hope, to everyone who's tuning in today. And we're going to dig into parts of that and begin to tease out how Trump is doing by the numbers. And if the numbers are a good way of benchmarking his performance, I'd like to remind all of you, you're welcome to leave comments in the live stream. Our brilliant producer, Mary Newman, will pluck those out of the ether and put them in front of us. And we will try to get to those questions amid the conversation we're about to begin about Trump metrics, Trump in the world, and useful ways to think about where the Trump administration is headed. Nir, I want to start with you and talk about some of the numbers that I think are probably, probably every performance number is important to Donald Trump, but certainly one of the barometers that he always looks at is the market performance, and particularly the stock market. But I think he looks at debt markets, and I think he sees Wall Street's sentiment about him and his administration as a sort of good housekeeping seal of approval around the policies he's pursuing. You have one of the pieces in our Trump package, our Trump metrics package today, about how markets think about Trump and how markets think about the White House generally. Set the table for us a little bit about your thinking when you wrote a piece like that.
Well, my general principle is that, and I think you can't go wrong with this assumption generally, is that markets don't really care about who's president. But Trump really does seem intent on being the exception to this rule. He's because the policies that he's undertaking are so sweeping that it's almost impossible to imagine that there's not going to be some impact. And I have in mind two things that I have in mind most are spending cuts and tariffs. I mean, I think those are the big two. There's also environmental regulation, there's taxes. I think those will be a smaller subset that will unfold later. But for now, I think those are the two big things. And, Trump likes to talk about the stock market a lot. And I think the reason is that that's mostly what investors, the U.S. public, is focused on. But I think what he ought to pay more attention to really is the bond markets, even though that's not really top of mind for people. And the reason I say that is because one of the things we have to ask ourselves is what is the impact of all this going to be? And I don't think any individual guess is going to be right necessarily, but I think the collective wisdom as expressed in markets is likely to be the best guess. And so that's why I think it's a good idea to keep an eye on what markets are doing. And the reason I say debt markets in particular is ultimately if Trump and his administration succeed in cutting spending on the level that they are saying that they will, we're really talking about fiscal austerity. And fiscal austerity should cause the economy to slow. And we ought to see that expressed as lower interest rates on a longer term interest rates. Let's call it the 10-year Treasury. We ought to see the 2-year Treasury, the short-term interest rate, telling us that means the Fed is going to have to stimulate. And we ought to see on the tariff side, we ought to see some of the inflation gauges starting to tick up. Okay, so with that as the set, what are we seeing? Interestingly, for the first few days of the administration, there really wasn't any movement, but there has been recently. The 2-year Treasury, which is the gauge for, I think, what the Fed is going to do, is down, meaning that there may be more Fed cuts this year than maybe we anticipated even 3 or 4 years ago. the 10-year treasury is down a lot. It's down about, from about 4.7 to about 4% now. That's signaling that the economy may be slowing because of at least these planned spending cuts. Because it's not only
which
about
of course is not the direction Trump wants things to go.
Correct. Yes. Thank you for that addition. And I look at also the break-even inflation, which is the difference between nominal treasuries and inflation-protected treasuries. In general, when that goes up, it's telling you that inflation expectations are going up, and it's not up a ton, but it is up. And so to recap, you have inflation expectations in the bond markets going up. You have interest rate expectations in the bond markets going down. What that's telling you is that the bond market is seeing potentially, and again, I don't want to make too much of it, but the directionality does matter. We are potentially seeing a combination of a slowing economy with higher inflation. That's just the opposite of what we want, obviously. We want an economy that's growing, and we want inflation that's lower. But that's why I say you really got to keep an eye on the bond market. I think that will tell you ultimately, that will be the first indicator of what the macroeconomic impacts of what these policies are going to be.
I want to roll you back for a second here to something you said at the top about how ambitious the spending cuts are envisioned by the Trump administration. The reality is all of the actions they've been taking thus far have been about the federal workforce and targeting federal agencies that cumulatively actually don't affect spending all that much. The federal government's labor spending is less than 2% of what the government spends annually. If the Trump administration really wanted to tackle government outlays, they'd have to think about things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense spending. The other big category of federal spending is just the interest the federal government pays on the debt, on its own debt. And they haven't really taken those things on just yet. And while they're getting headlines for sort of shock attacks on the federal workforce, they're also waging this tariffs war. And the tariff trade war under Trump really launched in earnest, I think, yesterday overnight and into this morning, where he's announced real crackdowns on China, Mexico, and Canada. What do you think about this mix of performance versus delivering on real spending cut promises? Do you think this is an administration that will get government spending under control in the way that they envision?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult because, as you say, the big ticket items are things, like Social Security, the so-called entitlement spending are things that they've already taken off the table. So it's hard to imagine that. There's been some, I would say, lukewarm promises to cut defense spending. It's possible that if they make enough noise about spending and interest rates go down, that the interest on the debt will go down, and that will give them some savings. But I think it's probably unlikely that there's going to be spending cuts in any meaningful way, which is why I think so far you're seeing a very tempered reaction by the bond market. The tariffs, I think, are slightly different because the tariffs, as we know, are coming today, and they're going to have a real impact. The question is, on the tariffs, where is that going to be expressed? And, I wrote a column about that recently, looking to see very specifically at the structure of the stock market, which is what Trump loves to tout, and where these tariffs are likely to bite. And what's interesting about the market is that the market, as we look at it, say the S&P 500, is by and large financials, technology, and healthcare. And those are not primarily the sectors that are in the path of the tariffs. And so I think it's possible that these tariffs, I would say even likely, that these tariffs are going to have an impact, that they're really going to bite. But I worry that bite is not going to be expressed in these broad market gauges, which will allow, I think, policymakers to sort of lazily come out and say, hey, look, we put on these tariffs and the market is doing great, and I told you they wouldn't bite. But underneath the surface of the market, where the smaller companies lay, the companies that are not in the S&P 500, the other 3,500 stocks, that they're the ones feeling the pain and no one's talking about it. So I think what that means.
And in fact, yesterday there was a big sell-off in small caps in response to this.
Yes. So I think you really have to be a savvy observer and not just go reflexively to the things that the administration might point you to in order to see what's going on. Having said all of that, I think we also have to be open to whatever sort of the outcome is, And like I said, I think the markets are going to be the first signal on all of this.
Nia, I want to segue off of Nir's thinking about the markets being a barometer and the way these tariffs are landing, that the industries they land on aren't necessarily represented in the S&P 500 or some of the broader market gauges, but where they are represented is on the human side in terms of jobs and in terms of the agricultural industries, manufacturing businesses. And of course, one of the other barometers he needs to worry about are voters. And when people lose their jobs or people have a harder time making a living, another barometer starts to send a warning sign to Trump, and that's voter sentiment and approval ratings. And you spent time in your piece for our Trump metrics package looking at how different presidents have fared around approval ratings during their various terms. And how do you see this intersection of Trump's policy making with voter sentiment? Is it too early to tell, or do you think are there some warning signs on the horizon?
Well, there are some warning signs. If you think about Donald Trump, he ran on the economy. He talked about the economy mainly as grocery prices and inflation and what voters were paying at the pump oftentimes. And if you look at the numbers, his approval rating is about 45%. The good news about that for Donald Trump is it's actually higher at this point than it was when he first took office in 2017. The bad news is that he still remains fairly unpopular relative to other presidents going into their second term or even first term. And the sort of unpopular number there, I think it's obviously because of Democrats and it's also because of independents. And if you look at the numbers, there is dissatisfaction with the way that Donald Trump has handled the economy so far, which is to say, most voters think he hasn't paid enough attention to it. It's something like 2/3 of American voters think that he just hasn't paid enough attention to it relative to what other things that he's doing. And we see a lot of what he's doing has to do with shrinking the federal government. We obviously saw what he's doing with Ukraine. And so that is, I think, the real warning sign for him. You think about the ways in which Americans think about whether or not they're doing well, the country is doing well. It all has to do with, do they have a job? Do their friends have jobs? And how many bags of groceries can they get at the Piggly Wiggly or the Winn-Dixie or wherever they shop? And so I think you think about Donald Trump, he comes onto the world stage, as a businessman, that is his calling card. And people really believe that they could see in him somebody who could sort of restore the economy. And so far, that's not happening. Again, it's early, but if you look at the ways he even talks about the economy, he kind of talks about it, not a lot as much as he talks about everything else. He talks about it in terms of tariffs. That'll likely not do so great in terms of the prices that Americans are paying at the grocery store and at Best Buy if they want to buy a new TV or whatever it is, or car. And so there's that part of it. And then there's a new way that he's kind of talking about it, this idea of like, there could be pain up front because of some of these tariffs, but the glory days will come at some point in terms of lower prices, right? There's this idea that Americans can endure some higher prices for a time with the hope that these tariffs bring back manufacturing and bring back all sorts of industry to the United States. That's his ultimate goal, it seems to be. But in the meantime, if you're paying more prices and you expect it in Donald Trump, somebody who's going to lower the prices, that could start to, I think, affect his approval rating. The other thing to think about with Donald Trump is that he obviously has the House and the Senate. They're probably going to pass some big package that increases the deficit, but also extends these tax cuts. I think it's going to be a while before average Americans actually see any sort of price cuts, any sorts of him addressing inflation in a real way. And it might not happen. I mean, Donald Trump himself has sort of talked about this idea that it's very hard to lower prices once they go up, right? So he, in some ways, has started to back away from that. But also, he has this message to Americans, which is like, okay, there might be some pain initially, but the good days won't be far behind that painful period that Americans might go through because of these tariffs.
That I want to stay on that for a second with you, Nia. Trump has proposed a federal tax cut of about 4.5, amounting to about $4.5 trillion in reduced revenue to the federal government. His administration has identified about another $2 trillion in spending cuts to offset that, but obviously there's a $2 trillion gap. And I've sort of enjoyed the various ways he and members of his administration have come up with these sort of carnival-esque mathematic equations to account for how they'll fill that gap, including the $5 million visa sale program. But I'll get to that with James. But the thing I want to focus on with you right here is this idea of Trump telling people there's pain coming and that we have to go through pain, and on the other side is Valhalla. And oftentimes, when he talks about the economy and he talks about the political landscape, it is about people mistreating the U.S. or mistreating U.S. workers or people who are aggrieved because the system is stacked against them, and that he is the bulwark against that, and that he essentially will be the savior who takes them to the promised land. And as long as they're ready to take a little bit of pain, usually he doesn't feel that pain himself. As we know, he's a wealthy man who is largely immune from most of the impacts of the things he's contemplating. There is going to be a reckoning at some point if Valhalla doesn't arrive, if the promised land isn't on the other side of the mountain. How have presidents typically been treated historically when they make grandiose promises about salvation and salvation doesn't end up arriving?
Well, listen, I mean, they typically feel it in maybe not getting reelected, or they'll feel it in the midterms. And Trump went through that his first term, where he got shellacked in the midterms. Obama, the same thing. That was mainly because of Obamacare. But I will say this. Trump is a different kind of president, and he has a hold on his voters that I don't think I haven't seen this kind of hold that a president has to his base in my lifetime. And, as we're talking about sort of pain and then heaven at the end, I sort of thought of this gospel song, and the line is, weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning time, right? And there is a religious aspect to the fervor that Donald Trump's followers feel for him. And a lot of these folks themselves have been in the pews of services on Sunday. And so they see in Donald Trump this kind of messianic figure that they're familiar with and they believe in. And so it could be quite a while before they stop believing in Donald Trump. And I'm not sure they ever will stop believing in Donald Trump as somebody who can redeem their lives, who can feel their pain, and really, I think, smite their enemies, right? That's part of what's going on too. It's like the anger is directed at the right people. And so
I've been trying to get my children to feel this way about me, but I'm unsuccessful.
So, we'll see. The midterms are in 2026. There's some of these Republicans in the House in particular are in districts that were won by Harris, only a handful, about 3, I think. So I don't know. I mean, I have been wrong about Donald Trump many, many times in judging him against typical politicians, typical presidents. And so in many ways going forward, I kind of want to throw out a lot of these metrics and a lot of these historical precedents, because he is such a unique figure that has just broken away from all the conventional wisdom around politics.
It is interesting because he is uniquely charismatic, and he has a unique hold on his base that defies statistics like unpopularity ratings, and he got reelected. Yep. James, we've been one of the broad tethering themes that we've been talking about is essentially Donald Trump is trying to deliver on campaign promises at this point, reviving an American economy that was already outperforming and robust, but creating a brighter economic future than the one that was already present. Reviving the American manufacturing sector, reviving the jobs that inhabit that sector. And tariffs are part of delivering on that promise. A market boom is part of delivering on that promise. And of course, one of the real billboard issues he campaigned on around inflation and the economy and tariffs was immigration. And this idea, that wasn't just an idea. In reality, the southern border with Mexico was porous, haphazardly administrated, and for many voters, a source of peril. On the other hand, framing the border that way and framing the challenge of a more efficiently patrolled border also runs up against the reality that immigration has always been the lifeblood of the U.S. economy and part and parcel of the American experience. You've covered immigration for a long time. How are you seeing where the Trump administration is situated now around immigration and on delivering on some of these campaign promises that Trump made about ending the peril at the border?
You and Nia have sort of nicely highlighted the tension between two of Trump's biggest promises. One, he's going to revive the economy. Second, as he said routinely throughout the campaign, he's going to launch the largest deportation operation in American history. And there's a real tension between those two goals. To just give you some idea of some of the numbers involved, over the last 5 years, about 5 million foreign workers have arrived in the U.S., and that's really swelled the workforce and generated growth and jobs and a lot of other things. And if you look at net migration, if you combine the number of undocumented people arriving and those who arrived with legal status, last year, I think net migration, the total of those people who arrived and stayed versus the total people who left or were deported, was about 4 million. Now, Goldman Sachs estimates that if all of Trump's restrictive immigration dreams come true, net immigration to the U.S. next year will be about 750,000. That's a huge drop. And you combine what Trump is doing with tariffs with what Trump wants to do in deportation, you can see some real contradictions in terms of the economic effects. For example, he's just said that he wants to institute tariffs on foreign agricultural exports to the United States. Well, guess what? Half the 850,000 crop pickers in the U.S. are undocumented. So if you really succeed in getting rid of undocumented workers, you're going to, give inflation a bit of a hit. I'm not an economist, but it seems to me that you can't, diminish the supply of labor without also raising the price of labor. So that's a big tension. And economic growth in general, a lot of people with much pointier heads and better economic brains than mine have pointed out that like if his immigration plans go into effect, you could end up having, knocking several tenths of a percentage point off GDP. And if you were to get rid of the entire undocumented population, or let's say even a significant portion, like 8 million, the Peterson Institute has estimated that you could have no net economic growth by 2028, which is a pretty staggering assessment. So right now, what they're concentrating on is, getting their mechanisms in place to deport more people than were deported during the Biden administration. J.D. Vance and others have talked about setting a goal of 1 million people being deported a year. Well, that would be quite an achievement. Over the last few years, the average has been about 350,000. Even with all the wheels that Trump has set into motion, they're not likely to beat the Obama peak deportations of about 423,000 in 2013. You look at the media reports about what they've been able to achieve so far, and it doesn't look like they're going to be even on track to beat that 2013 number. So, they can't do what they want to do.
James, just pause on that for a minute. What are the practicalities that get in the way of, this is an administration that promised during the campaign to deport as many as, I think, 11 to 12 million immigrants, to use a vast array of detention camps to house people who are going to be processed out of the country. They've already begun using military bases and Guantanamo as detention camps. But when you talk about how hard it is to the work of actually deporting millions of people, what are the roadblocks to that?
The biggest roadblock is money. And right now the budget for immigration, the ICE agency, is about $9 billion a year, and they've got about 7,000 people involved in enforcement. Now, Tom Homan, who is Trump's immigration czar, is asking for anywhere from $86 billion to $175 billion to strengthen enforcement. That's a huge increase, and one of the reasons that they're having trouble getting this machinery ramped up is they just don't have the money. As you noted, they've done a lot of firsts. One thing is roping in things like IRS agents or even State Department special agents to participate in rounding up people that can be deported. The other thing they've done is that they've said they're going to use military planes to deport people. Well, guess what? Military planes cost about 3 times as much as an ordinary charter flight for deportation purposes, and they also carry fewer people. So that's really kind of not a very cost-effective measure. They're also ramping up deportations at the interior, which are generally much more expensive to people because you've got to find people, and then you've got to get the resources in place. You've got to coordinate with local authorities. A lot of the deportations that happened during the Biden administration involved folks who were within 100 miles of the border, and now they're going for a much harder group to track down and catch. So there are a lot of just systemic obstacles that they've got to overcome, and unless they succeed in getting legislation and appropriations from Congress, they're not going to have an easy time of it.
And of course, a reason a lot of those folks are here, a lot of those human beings who were reducing the statistics and the detention camp processing, they're here because businesses want them here. That they contribute fundamentally in industries like construction, agriculture, hotels, restaurants, and some of the inefficiencies in the immigration system are problematic, not simply because people are coming across the border who may not be wanted, but because there are more people coming across the border who everyone wants, but the system can't process them effectively.
Absolutely. About 5% of the U.S. labor force is undocumented. That rises up to like a quarter in construction. And as noted in agriculture, it's a big issue. So the existing programs that we have for admitting unskilled labor and skilled labor just aren't adequate to the demand that the U.S. economy has for these workers. For example, taking skilled H-1B visas, about 400 some odd thousand people applied for those visas last year. 1/3 actually received them. You look at the demand for unskilled labor. There's no cap on farm workers, but there is a cap on folks who work in construction and elsewhere, and those caps aren't just nearly enough to meet the demand. So the U.S. economy needs legal workers in order to run effectively. That's it.
Another framing thing that I want to touch on with you is how we think about trade. I just had the pleasure of spending several days with you in Mexico City. You're a great journalist. You're constantly asking questions. You're curious about things. So you're a great travel partner. and we were with another great journalist, our colleague JP Spinetto, in Mexico City. And while we were there, we met with a collection of Mexican business executives overseeing technology, electronics, manufacturing, a number of different operations. And one of the things that landed with me there, their great complaint, these are business people who see the U.S. as an ally, as they don't see it simply as a trading relationship. They see it as this deep integrated partnership that isn't about just throwing marbles back and forth across the border, trading a marble for a screwdriver or this for that. It's actually very integrated and sophisticated supply chains that are central to things like automobile manufacturing and electronics and on down the line, that aren't just easily unwound, and that, you know, a meaningful portion of Mexican exporters to the U.S. are from companies that are actually U.S. owned. And they feel blindsided and aggrieved by what they see as this sledgehammer approach to policymaking via tariffs, and the peril of actually unwinding a relationship that is good for everyone involved. What did you take away from being on the ground there around things like this?
Exactly that point about how intertwined the relationships were, and also just, I think, how, for whatever reason, it seems to be very hard to kind of get that message across to ordinary Americans. You know, one of the statistics that jumped out to me was that, 80% of whatever's sold at Walmart is manufactured in Mexico. That's if you suddenly slap tariffs on that, you're going to see that affecting a lot of people who shop at a place that's really important to them. And I think the other aspect that people forget is that, at least I'm going back to the immigration point, this interdependence, these flows have been building for a long time. For example, back in the, during the height of what was called the Bracero program, when Mexicans came over and worked legally on American farms.
In the 1950s.
Right. In 1954, you had about 450,000 Braceros who were coming over here. And they came over here legally to work, and so many of them settled here. There's a strong fiber, of relations between our two countries that rests on, those ties. And, it's not, if you're not on a border state, if you're, up in the Northeast or in the Northwest, you may not feel that as much, but those human ties are very real. And the sense of bewilderment, the sense of fear, the sense of mutating toward hostility was palpable.
I just want to remind our audience that there is this amazing collection of videos, data visualizations, and richly analytic columns that are part of our Trump metrics package, which you can find on Bloomberg Opinion at the Bloomberg.com collection of websites. And it's a very thorough accounting of what we can pin down through data and analysis on where the Trump White House is thus far. Mia, we've been talking about various report cards, whether it's economic data, voter sentiment, market data, jobs data. This is a tough question to answer, but I'm going to ask you it anyway because you're good at answering tough questions. But I'm setting you up here. But I've always thought of Trump as somebody who really doesn't care that much at the end of the day about report cards. I think he feels he can kind of defy gravity most of the time. That even if things right now, if his approval rating is down or the stock market is down, he'll locate someone outside of the numbers, or a force outside of the numbers, or an institution outside of the numbers to wag his finger at and say, well, it would be better, but the Biden administration did this, or it would be better, but Congress is sitting on its hands, or it would be better, but my critics are insane. And Do you think, having watched him in his first term, is he situated right now in his second term to ride out what might be a period of rough numbers before some of the things he's reaching for arrive?
Yes, I mean, I think, if you think about his first, what is it been 2 months? If you think about what he's done in these first 2 months outside of Congress, using the bully pulpit, using Elon Musk, installing his people in these top jobs that no one would ever think that Pete Hegseth would be Secretary of Defense, but somehow Donald Trump convinced members of his party in the Senate to confirm Pete Hegseth to be Secretary of Defense. So in so many ways, he's won already, right? If he goes 2 years and maybe the House flips in 2026, his accomplishments will stack up against any other president in terms of reordering the global world order, siding with Russia, slashing the federal government to an extent that no one ever expected. I imagine that he's going to get his legislative agenda passed fairly easily, given the hold he has on folks in the House and in the Senate. So I think maybe he looks at some of these numbers, particularly the approval numbers and the polling. He says, oh, who cares in so many ways? He says, oh, these are, Gallup is corrupt, or, the Washington Post is corrupt in polling, they're calling dead people, or whatever his excuse would be. I do think there is more to, the bond market and what sort of the rich people say, right? And the way that the stock market reflects the sentiment of people who have money and their approval or disapproval of Donald Trump, perhaps. But again, I think, as you said, he has this amazing ability to wave away bad news, push through that bad news, and convince his followers that there's a big conspiracy theory against him, and they shouldn't believe polls or numbers from the stock market. They should believe him. And so I think he's kind of on a glide path for the next 2 years in terms of being able to do what he wants to do, because we've seen so far that what Donald Trump has wanted to do, he has been able to do pretty easily.
That's the story of his life. Nir, I want to end up with you. We've run out of time remarkably, because I could have sat here with all three of you for another hour. I think our audience could too, but I won't test their patience. Nir, you spend a lot of time speaking to individual investors, institutional investors, people in the business community. Do you think, what is the sentiment thus far within the business community broadly defined, based, and I know this is anecdotal, and I'm just asking kind of for your own read, but is there a surprise that he's doubling down on tariffs? Is there a surprise that he's pursuing policies that are likely to be inflationary? Is there any kind of an awakening to, oh, this is the person we supported, and some of the things he's pursuing may not be that good for business?
I think the business community, my read of the business community is aligned with, I think, what it seems to me a lot of people are feeling, which is that there seems to be just an enormous amount of uncertainty. And uncertainty is a word we use a lot, or at least I use often. I don't know that I can be emphatic enough in the use of that word in this moment. It feels like, to me, and from what I'm hearing from people, is that the ethos of the technology world has really seeped into policymaking, in the sense that we are going to try something big, and we are going to gamble with what the effects of those things are going to be. And they might work out great, and they might work out horribly, and there might be everything in the middle. And I don't know that in my adult lifetime, I can remember an administration willing to gamble on such a large scale with so much simultaneously. And I think the business community is really feeling that, which is why, I started really with looking at market gauges, which is, I think that is sort of, if you want something that's not anecdotal, it's sort of like the average of what everyone thinks, right? So if you want to know what the business investing community thinks, that's probably where you want to go. But what I would argue is that everybody is feeling the same thing. And, it's not, I think you'd have to go back to the New Deal to find someone who has been as ambitious about transforming government, the country, et cetera, as what we're seeing now. And we're just going to have to see on a number of dimensions, wages and inflation, and the structure of the labor market, and really the inner working, as you alluded to in your conversation with James, the inner working of this global economy that was strung together for better and for worse over the last 20, 30 years. So I think that's really the theme. The theme is, we're trying things that are huge. We're taking huge risks, and no one knows how they're going to turn out.
So uncertainty will be our watchword until we convene again. And I hope the rest of you who are out there trying to adjust and deal with uncertainty can find your way through each day. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg Opinion. I was joined today by three of our columnists, Nir Kaysar, Nia Malika Henderson, and James Gibney. That's it for today. We'll see you next week, and thank you for joining us.